Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Grace Estrada. This is Psych 18 Research Methods. Today, we're going to talk about non-experimental research, and that is Chapter 6. So anytime we do a study, and sometimes people use the word experiment as a synonym for study, not every type of research that we do is an experiment. Remember that experiments have one purpose, and that is to establish causality. When we think about validity, experiments are the design that have the highest form of internal validity. Remember, internal validity is a researcher's confidence that the reason the dependent variable changed is because of the independent variable. So it has high internal validity because what we do in an experiment is we manipulate the independent variable. We establish that the dependent variable's values changed after we manipulated the independent variable. And we also use random assignment to minimize any kind of systematic differences there could be in participant among our sample. So with an experiment, we have high internal validity. Remember that there's always a trade-off. When you have high internal validity, you end up losing external validity because the more control you exert on a situation, the less natural it is. If something is not a natural situation, then the likelihood that the results can be generalized to other populations, other contexts, decreases. And so since experiments have higher internal validity and lower external validity, in contrast, non-experimental methods have higher external validity. And so we use a lot, the truth is that we use many more non-experimental methods than we do experimental methods. But we still need to consider the four main validities, even with non-experimental methods, right? Content validity is how we operationalize the concepts we're thinking about. Remember that in psychology, many of the concepts are inside our brains, right? We can't actually see them. We cannot read people's minds. So operationalization is extremely important in psychological studies. We do this in two ways. We have the conceptual definition, where we look at previous existing research. We look at the concepts that are involved, right? The different dimensions involved in the concept. And then we have the operational definition, where we look at something specific, observable, and measurable in our study. We are interpreting those observable components as a reflection of that internal psychological construct. And finally, we have statistical validity, which is the analysis of the data we're collecting. So when we come up with our operational definitions, we come up with our research question, we need to think about the scales of measure for the data we're collecting, because that is going to impact the type of analysis we can do. So experimental methods, we start off with that because there are specific characteristics in experiments, right? We have the manipulation of the independent variable, we have random assignment, we have elimination of alternative explanations through that manipulation, temporal precedence, and random assignment. In non-experimental methods, right, we are missing manipulation of the independent variable. That is the biggest difference between non-experimental and experimental research. Even though we don't manipulate the independent variable, non-experimental research has many, many uses. We might use it for a research question that only involves a single variable, right? Descriptive research. So descriptive research, we are just trying to understand what are the different characteristics involved in this phenomenon. If the research question does not seek to establish a causal statistical association between variables, then we can use a non-experimental design. If the independent variable cannot be manipulated, or the participants cannot be randomly assigned into groups, we cannot use an experiment, right? There are many ethical situations in which we cannot randomly assign people. For example, smoking. You can't randomly assign a baby to be in a group that will smoke for every day of their adult life. Finally, if the goal is research of the research is description or exploration, there is no need to use an experimental design. A non-experimental design will be fine. Any questions about the purposes of non-experimental research designs? Okay. There are major types of non-experimental research. First is correlational. Second is qualitative. A third one is observational. And a fourth one is change over time. And I'll talk about each one. So remember, in terms of correlations, what we're looking at, this is quantitative, right? We are looking at a statistical association between two variables. What we are trying to see is there systematic, predictable change, a connection between these two variables? We're not looking for causation. Remember, correlation is not causation. Why do we say it isn't causation? It's because we're not doing manipulation. We don't know which one causes the other. We can have an idea. So when we have an idea of which one is more influential, we will use that as the quote unquote independent variable. And that's how we will graph it. But remember, we are not actually establishing causation. So we do not at all attempt to manipulate an independent variable. We're not trying to control extraneous variables. We are just looking at how these two variables systematically connect to each other, or if they even do. We use correlations for the goal of description. We use it for the goal of prediction. We use it to establish reliability. Remember that we have those three types of reliability. We have the internal consistency reliability. We have the internal inter-rater reliability and test-retest reliability. Those are all correlations. We're seeing how the scores at one time correlate or systematically relate to the other ones. And we also use it for establishing validity in terms of our discriminant validity, convergent validity, concurrent validity, and predictive validity. We use that to establish the criterion validities. We also use correlations as converging evidence to support a theory. So we might look at, for example, in terms of depression, we may look at the correlation of somebody's self-reported depression score and self-esteem. There's a strong correlation, negative correlation, where the higher somebody's level of depression, the lower their self-esteem, right? So those are correlations that we look at. We also use correlations very frequently in a lot of descriptive studies. So correlations are a very powerful form of analysis that we use. When we talk about correlations, remember that the lowest value is a -1 and the highest value is +1. Remember that the negative and positive do not speak to the strength, to the the negative and positive do not speak to the strength of the correlation. It's called a valence. Negative correlations mean that as one value goes up, the other value goes down. Positive correlations mean that both values increase together. In a perfect world, right, a perfect negative correlation would be a negative line that looks like the yellow component, right? So as you see, when one value, when the, we always call the horizontal axis the x-axis, and that's where we would plot what we consider the independent variable. The vertical axis is known as the y-axis, and that's where we would plot the dependent variable. So as you can see, the value of the dependent variable is high. The independent variable would be low, and then as the dependent variable value goes down, the independent variable goes up. That's a perfect negative correlation. A -0.5 correlation, you can see in the orange, it's not as easy to spot, but you can kind of see a general trend that is going down. And that's more likely what you would see in a research study. And then no correlation would mean there's no predictable systematic change between the two values. A positive 0.5 correlation, you start to see that both values start to increase together. And then a perfect positive correlation is in blue, where it's unit per unit increase, that as the independent variable value increases, the dependent variable value increases as well. Usually in research, we want a 0.8 correlation strength to indicate, really strong associations between the two variables. Any questions about this little recap on correlations? Okay, so what are some limitations we have with correlations? Well, if it's a non-linear relationship, we can't really capture that. It's also misleading when we have what we call a restriction of range, meaning that sometimes if a researcher has a data set in which the correlations are a little bit fuzzy, right? Like here, let's say the 0.5. What some researchers do is they will only report a portion of the scatter plot. So they're limiting the range of the values that they're presenting to people, and that can be extremely misleading. So, for example, if you just look at maybe the first quarter of it, it looks like there's not really much correlation. But if you look at maybe the first two values, it looks like it's a positive correlation, but you don't see the rest of the scatter plot that is actually more of a fairly medium negative correlation. So anytime a researcher limits how much of the data they're showing, it's called restriction of range, and that can be extremely misleading. Also, as I mentioned before, correlations cannot establish causation. We don't know directionality. We don't know which one changed first before the other one, showed the value, the relationship. And there's also the idea of a third variable problem, meaning there could be an association between two variables because an unknown third variable exists. Example for that would be the watching violent shows and levels of aggression. The third variable would be parental supervision, right? So kids who watch violent shows, but have a parent sitting there explaining to them what's going on, do not exhibit the same high levels of aggression as children who are unsupervised. So that's an example of a third variable problem. Any questions about correlational research? Okay, they're very frequent, especially, surveys are an example of correlational research. We get lots of variables and we look at systematic relationships among those variables. So in this class, we really focus on quantitative research. It's important to mention qualitative research as well. So qualitative research really had its origins in anthropology and sociology. In qualitative research, we focus on people's words. What are they saying, right? So what do we use qualitative research for? Oftentimes, it is for describing a phenomenon. If we're just learning about a phenomenon, we might use qualitative research to find out how people are experiencing this phenomenon. It's great for generating new research questions as we learn more about something from people's individual experiences. We might come up with new research questions. In qualitative research, we usually collect data through interviews. Focus groups are another way that we might do it. And oftentimes nowadays, we record the interviews. Interviews are a one-on-one basis. Focus groups, on the other hand, are with a small group of people. And sometimes, depending on the construct you're researching, people may feel more comfortable speaking about it in a group situation. When we analyze qualitative research, we have to use a coding manual. So coding manual is a manual that is created after the data is collected. So you have transcripts of what people are saying. And the coding manual accounts for every phrase that is said in order to help the researchers interpret the dialogue consistently. So with qualitative research, you need to establish inter-rater reliability. Remember, in inter-rater reliability, what you have is two different people looking at the same transcript and coming to the same conclusion 80% of the time. 0.8 correlation with agreement for inter-rater reliability. And it's an iterative process. So you might have an initial coding manual, and then if you, let's say you come up with a 0.6 agreement between the two readers, you're going to have to refine your coding manual until you get 0.8 agreement between the two people who are looking at the transcripts. So it's qualitative research is easier in the sense that, you know, you just come up with questions to ask people. The hard work comes on the other end when you have to interpret things people say. And so a good qualitative researcher has to come up with really refined questions so that the people who are being interviewed can respond in a way that it, you know, provides the data that you're looking for. So grounded theory is one way that we use interpret qualitative data. Grounded theory is not where you're testing a paradigm. So in quantitative research, you are testing a framework. You come up with hypotheses and you determine if the data, you know, supports it or not. In qualitative research, it's a different perspective. Here, we might be developing new theory. So grounded theory is theory that is developed from the transcripts and the data that you've collected in a qualitative design. So you're not testing hypotheses in a qualitative design. You're trying to have a deeper understanding of a phenomenon and maybe developing new theory yourself. Discourse analysis is another way that we analyze qualitative data. In discourse analysis, you are looking at components such as the pitch, you know, the way people are speaking, the pauses that are going on. Obviously, you need a recording for this kind of analysis. The words that are using, that they're using, the types of fillers that they have. There are many components to discourse analysis. It's another way of analyzing transcripts and recordings that people have of interviews and focus groups. Any questions on data collection and analysis of qualitative research?
Do we have to do this in our research paper?
If you decide that you want to do a qualitative design, then you would have to discuss this component. You're not actually doing it, but you would have to discuss, you know, what is involved in it. Because if you remember, it's a proposal. So a proposal would indicate that you are considering all of these components when you conduct your study. Remember, a proposal would be written into a protocol that goes to the Human Subjects Institutional Review Board. So they would want to know, what are the questions you're asking? How are you going to maintain people's confidentiality? How are you going to analyze this, you know, the data that you get? So those are things that have to be included in a research proposal. Any other questions? Okay, mixed methods combines qualitative and quantitative approaches. So with mixed methods, we're looking at converging evidence. We would look for correlations among different measures, and we would look to see how the qualitative components that you analyze support the quantitative components and vice versa. So mixed methods, that's my personal favorite. But it includes a lot of work because what you're doing in mixed methods, you're probably using surveys for the quantitative components. So there's going to be a self-report aspect to it. And then there would be also the interviews or focus groups that you would have. So you would have to be establishing both inter-rater reliability and also the retest reliability or internal consistency reliability as well. But in terms of validity, mixed methods has a fairly high validity because you are combining numerous methods into one study. So triangulation is what we call it. When we use the information from both quantitative and qualitative methods to come up to a conclusion that should be evident. So with mixed methods, you would also be establishing the inter-rater reliability. Questions about mixed methods? So as I mentioned in this class, we primarily do quantitative approaches. That's what we're looking at. So with quantitative approaches, what we're looking at are numbers, right? What kind of data are we doing that? We have numbers. So scales of measure are important. Remember, the only scales of measure that are quantitative are interval or ratio scale variables. For nominal or ordinal variables, that would be under qualitative types of studies. So an example would be like the number of time a child swears. That would be quantitative. The words a child is using to express anger, on the other hand, that would be qualitative. So, you could use both. So with quantitative approaches, we're really looking at statistical analysis, and the conclusions that we draw are meant to determine if a hypothesis is supported or not supported. Remember, with quantitative approaches, we are starting with a framework or a paradigm that guides us to developing hypotheses. We collect the data and we determine if the data either support or do not support the hypotheses that we came up with. With qualitative approaches, remember, it's words, the focus is on interpretations. The conclusions that we come up with are based on the interpretations of the words or observations that we have determined. The idea is we are not testing hypotheses with qualitative approaches. We are developing a deeper understanding of a psychological construct, and we might be developing new theories ourselves. So in terms of kind of comparing it, what are the advantages? Well, a qualitative study is useful for theory development. It gives us rich detail, really in-depth accounts, right? We are describing behavior or phenomena. On the other hand, quantitative studies are really good for external validity, is good for hypothesis testing, theory testing, and we get larger samples. So qualitative studies are not high in internal validity or external validity unless it has been replicated with many different studies. So generally, we usually use quantitative studies because of the external validity that it gives us, right? So up to you how you want to approach it. There's value in both. Remember, if you want a deeper understanding of what's going on, go with a qualitative study. If you want to know how much the prevalence of this construct, then you would go quantitative because you want to get a large sample size to see, is this happening to many people? So a lot of times you would start off with a quantitative study to find out how prevalent is it. And then you might go into a qualitative study to find out what is really happening with these different groups. And so qualitative studies, remember, you're using much smaller sample sizes. You'd probably be going with a homogeneous group. So what's happening? Let's do a focus group with 10-year-olds, maybe 10-year-old females, maybe 10-year-old Latina females, and then you would go to another focus group of 10-year-old Asian females or something like that. So qualitative studies, it's not good in terms of external validity. And you would have to do a lot of explanation to establish the content validity as well, right? So you would want to do quite a lot of literature review so that you can establish any questions you're asking are really reaching the heart of the matter of the concept you're studying. But there are always advantages and disadvantages to both types of approaches. Any questions about qualitative and quantitative studies? So a type of qualitative study is observational. Because in observational studies, you are recording things, but you can also do an observational study in a quantitative fashion if you're looking at the frequency of things happening. There are different ways that you can analyze an observational study. Main types of observational studies are naturalistic, participant observation, structured observation, case studies, and archival research are all considered types of observations. So in naturalistic observation, it sounds exactly like what it says. You are looking at people in a natural environment, or quote unquote in the field. So this really started in anthropology. For example, Diana Fossey went to, Africa to study gorillas. So that was naturalistic observation. She went there to their environment and started recording what it was she was seeing, how the gorillas behaved. What kind of things do you observe? Well, you can observe a broad range of behaviors, like try to record everything you see in a short time period, or you could be looking for specific behaviors. So it depends on, again, what your research question is, what your goal is. If it's just to describe, then you're going to want to describe, go for broad behaviors in a given group in a short time span. On the other hand, maybe if it's like it's prediction, you might be establishing, certain characteristics that exist in the sample you're looking for and seeing if you can anticipate behavior in a given time period again. So it depends on how you want to observe, on how you want to approach it. In a naturalistic observation, the kinds of data we would have are something called field notes, where people actually take pen and paper and write down what's going on. Video or audio data, audio data, that's very common and frequent now. It's so easy to record observations. It could be interviews with quote unquote informants, and it could be some kind of documents from the setting. So for example, if you're observing children and you wanted to collect kinds of drawings that they would, create after a certain event, then that could be part of your observational data. In terms of goals, what we want in naturalistic observation is a complete, accurate description. We would be describing the setting, the events, and the people, and we want to analyze the observation, right? What are the themes or patterns we see in the data? You would have to write down specific examples from the data to support your interpretation. And remember, you're going to have to establish inter-rater reliability from all of this. Naturalistic observations are not used for hypothesis testing. It is a kind of qualitative data where you want to learn more about what's happening. In a systematic observation, what you're doing is you're observing one or more specific behaviors in a particular setting. So with a systematic observation, you are not observing and recording everything that occurs. Here, you're looking for the occurrence or frequency of very specific behaviors. So that's something that can be counted or quantified. So there's a big difference there with the naturalistic and the systematic observation. So with systematic observation here, you would be testing a hypothesis. You likely are testing for predictability. So now what you need to be concerned about is your coding system, right? So in terms of a systematic observation, how are you going to measure that behavior of interest? What counts as that behavior of interest? So let's say it's friendliness. What you're going to look at is you're going to see how many times that these kids exhibit these behaviors that could be interpreted as friendliness. So again, you would have to have a coding system that can interpret all the different behaviors that you see in this setting. And you would have to establish inter-rater reliability. So the systematic observation is a type of observation where you could be testing a hypothesis and very likely looking for, your goal would likely be predictability. Any questions about systematic observation?
Is there like an example of like a famous study that's sort of like this?
With well, systematic observations, I'll have to think of that because I haven't really. Will have in your discussion, you're going to read about a naturalistic observation, but let me think about that and I'll see if I can post something in the class for that. But We have different observations that we've used. For example, I'm not sure if you know what change blindness is. That's a really great study where you are taking people in a naturalistic setting and you're changing something in between them. So you're actually, it's an observation, it's an experiment, but you're using observation in it as well. And you're seeing if people can detect a change in the person they're talking to. So sometimes it'll be, you have two strangers talking, and then something will go in between them, and they'll change something about the person, the Confederate, who's talking to the participant, like their clothes or their hat. And sometimes they've even changed the person who's talking. And they want to see if the person, the participant who doesn't know all this stuff is happening, if their behavior changes in any way. So that would be an example of where you could be, it's systematic because you are examining a specific behaviors of the participants in this setting. And you would be counting, okay, do they show surprise? Do they ask questions? So that's an example of a systematic observation where you would have to have a coding system to interpret how the person, the participant, is reacting to the change, or if they don't react at all. So that's one example where you could be using systematic observation. And there are a lot of studies that do change blindness that are really fun. And I can post that in the class. Any other questions? Okay, some methodological issues that you need to be aware of. So when we talk about methodological issues, that means it is a challenge to validity. Okay, so one is participation. Is the observer in the class or are they concealed, right? So you could have two ways. Sometimes, for example, that example I gave you of Diana Fossey going into the Gorillas of the Mist, she wasn't hiding. She was actually in the forest with the gorillas. And what if you are going to be in the room with the people you're participating, you have to make sure that you are as innocuous as possible, that you aren't calling any attention to yourself because you want the people to behave as naturally as possible. Ideally, you would increase validity if you're concealed, right? If, somehow you can watch the kids playing. Oftentimes, it would unfortunately involve like bringing them into a special classroom where there's a one-way mirror and then you can watch them play. So I went to UC Santa Cruz. What's nice at UC Santa Cruz is they have child development centers that are designed for people to do research. And so the rooms have one-way mirrors. So the kids are used to, it's a naturalistic setting in the sense that these are the classrooms that the kids go into. What they don't know is that there are one-way mirrors so that people, students, graduate students, and researchers can be behind that mirror and observe the kids and not disturb them in any way. So that's an example of concealment, right? So you ideally that has higher validity than if the person is in the room. Because as soon as the person is in the room, that could change the dynamic of the room. Kids might be looking and saying, oh my goodness, who's this stranger here? And that would change the way they behave. So you want to minimize anything that will impact the behavior of the participants. Reliability, as I mentioned, you need to establish inter-rater reliability. That's really important, at least 0.8 agreement. Keep revising the coding until you get to that agreement. Sampling. So here we're talking about sampling the observations. How often are you observing the people? How long is the observation? So the frequency and length of the observation is important to establish. Equipment, if you're doing any kind of recording, what happens if your equipment fails? If you're using your phone, what if the Wi-Fi goes badly? We all know that happens, right? So these are kind of methodological issues that you need to consider as a researcher. And the last one is reactivity. So reactivity is what I was talking about in terms of participation. That is the possibility that the observer's presence, just being there, will affect the behavior being observed. So these are the different components that a person considering observational research needs to address in their proposal and in their protocols for IRB. Any questions?
Um, if if they're already in the study, and then like I don't know, for whatever reason, suddenly the like participants like realize they're being observed, would they need to scrap the experiment?
Well, it's not an experiment, right? It depends. It's a study. So remember, don't use experiment and study synonymously because they aren't. An experiment is a specific type of study where you have the manipulation of the independent variable. So in terms of the observation, if participants realize that somebody's observing them and all, like it would have to be a number of participants, right, to really scrap it. It could, if you're in a classroom with kids and one kid says, "Hey, who's that stranger over there?" And then, everyone like gathers around the stranger, then I would say, yes, you're going to have to redo the study somehow. Um, but on the other hand, maybe if it's just one kid and he just looks at the researcher, but then goes on playing and it doesn't seem to disrupt it, then I would say it would be okay. But in the write-up, you would have to acknowledge that this occurred. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, case studies. So case studies are used when you have a very unusual situation, like something that doesn't happen very, very often. So in a case study, it would just be one person, one setting. It could be naturalistic observation, or it could be a psychologist's description, or it can be a historical account. For example, there was the whole idea of Jeannie, the wild child. She grew up without any kind of human contact for the first, I think, 12 years of her life. So that is a very unusual, rare, noteworthy condition. And people used it, to study as much as they could. And this is how we came to realize that there is a critical period for acquiring language. Because no matter how much people tried to teach Jeannie to speak a language, she couldn't express it. So after the age of 12, if you have not acquired your first language, you're not going to be able to have a first language. So there's a critical period for acquiring the first language, and there is a sensitive period for acquiring subsequent languages. And that is, again, by the age of 12, if you haven't got, if you're not fully bilingual, it's going to be harder to learn another language after the age of 12. Not impossible, but it's just more difficult. So case studies, we don't use it that often, but when the opportunity arises, we certainly do as much learning and understanding about the situation as possible. Archival research. So with archival research, what are we doing? Sorry. Oh, I should have written it up. I'll have to change that. It includes statistical records. It includes survey archives. It could be publicly available communication analysis of maybe so many like political tweets even. You could make that archival research. So it's content analysis. So for example, in that study by Smith and al. 1994, what they did here was they analyzed children's ads. And they wanted to see if they were targeting specific, components for male kid, for boys versus girls. And what they found was that, stereotype behavior was very prevalent in these ads. What they also noticed was boys were featured more frequently, right? This is back in 1994. Things may have changed. Probably not. Boys, when they showed them, were usually outdoors. Girls, when they showed girls, they were usually in home settings, right? So these are just kind of things that you could do for archival research. It does not, remember, archival research is still primary source research. So this is something that many students have had a misunderstanding about. Looking at other people's studies is not archival research. You need to be examining primary source documents, meaning things like birth records, right? Certificates, birth certificates, divorce certificates, things that are publicly available, even primary source, again, meaning that it is something somebody actually produced themselves. Looking at existing research is not archival research, because those people who did the research, they're looking at primary source data. What they're doing is giving an interpretation and discussion of what they produced. That is not considered archival research. So make sure you understand that. But archival research can be a lot of fun. If you're into content analysis, you might look at Facebook posts from a specific time period on a specific group. That would be a type of archival research. Also, something to consider is that archival research, remember, is completely exempt research, because you are not actually, your quote unquote participants are types of data, are the data that you're collecting. You're not interacting with any humans whatsoever. You are simply looking at different primary source documents and analyzing it in a specific way. So for archival research, you would have a hypothesis. You would be testing if the hypothesis is supported by data from a certain time period, for example. That's usually what would be happening. So with archival research, you're not trying to generate new theories in this. You are testing a hypothesis if it is supported by data from a specific time period and from primary source documents. So the primary source documents would be your samples. That's what we'd be using for archival research. Any questions about archival research? Okay, the last type of non-experimental design would be developmental. So this means change over time. So what we're looking at are longitudinal, cross-sectional, cohort sequential, or sequential. In longitudinal designs, we have one age group and we follow them over time, right? So in a longitudinal design, it's very powerful. I'm a developmental psychologist, so this is like the gold standard for discovering developmental change. Why? Because we have the same group of people and we're bringing them back. We can actually witness developmental change each time we bring them back. Keep in mind that in longitudinal designs, you're using other methods as well. Probably you're doing a survey where you're getting self-report. You could be interviewing the people every time you come back. So there could be a mixed methods component. You could be taking physiological readings on the people every time you bring them back, so that you're seeing, is there a physical change? Does that correlate with the cognitive change and socio-emotional change that they're experiencing as well? So longitudinal, remember, it's one age group and you're bringing them back over and over again. The con to it is that it is expensive. There's usually high dropout or attrition. And it's also sensitive to what we call cohort differences. Because it's the same age group, then things that we are observing about them could be specific to their cohort. For example, kids who were born during COVID, that's a specific cohort. So as we bring them back every, 2 years or something like that, what they are experiencing could be specific to them because they were born during COVID, because the first 2 years of their life, all they saw were people with masks and there was a shelter in place. So all of these components have to be considered as we bring them back and we observe how they are developing over time. So longitudinal, how do we know that it's happening? When in a popular article, for example, they would be talking about bringing them back, right? So this is an example of an article that was on a study that was in UC Santa Cruz, right? UC Santa Cruz is chosen to carry on landmark study chronicling the lives of 100 individuals. So they started in 1968, and so this study has been more than 25 years, and we keep bringing them back. But the problem is they started off with 100 individuals, probably didn't end up with 100 because people move away, they get bored, they die. all these things, count to the attrition of this study, but it's still a fascinating study because they kept bringing them back. Another type of developmental design is cross-sectional. This is far more frequent, right? Now in cross-sectional design, we have people of different age groups, and we take a point in time, survey or some kind of study. We don't bring them back over and over again. Here, it's just one point in time, and we are inferring that the differences indicate the developmental change. So for example, if we did a cross-sectional study where we just take a survey of kids from age 8 up to 28, right? People that age, and we ask them about their experience of COVID. The way the 8-year-olds respond, if we compare that to the way the 15-year-olds respond, and we compare that to the way the 28-year-olds respond, these are all different people. So what we're doing is we are inferring the differences, the different experiences of the age groups, but we don't actually know because they're different people. If that's the people who are 8-year-olds, if that's how they would respond when they're 15, and if that's how they would respond when they're 28. So with cross-sectional design, you have to infer the process of change, right? And it's more frequent because it's cheaper, it's less time consuming, it's less expensive. And there is a lot that we can learn about people using cross-sectional designs. Any questions about this one? So here, whenever you hear something like a portrait, that's a cross-sectional design, right? It's literally, it's like taking a one point in time understanding of what people are experiencing. So sometimes you'll hear the term snapshot or portrait. Here, this is an example of cross-sectional design where they started talking about children and safety. And you see they did the breakdown by age group, 7th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade. So that's an example of the way that data from a cross-sectional design would be portrayed. So that idea, when you hear portrait, snapshot, those are the terms that indicates it's cross-sectional. The last type of design to talk about is cohort sequential. This is where it starts off cross-sectional, and then you follow them over time. So you take different age groups, and then you bring them back over and over again, and that becomes cohort sequential. The idea here is that you're combining kind of the best of both worlds with longitudinal and cross-sectional. So it is similar to longitudinal in that it is still expensive, you still experience attrition, and it's similar to cross-sectional because you have different age groups. So it's a nice combination of both. Any questions about longitudinal, cross-sectional, and cohort sequential? Okay, so here is a summary of the different types of non-experimental research. You have correlational, right? That is predictable. What we're looking for is predictable systematic change. This is quantitative, absolutely quantitative. So correlations, remember, we use that to establish reliability. We use it to establish different types of criterion validity as well. And correlational studies are most often surveys because surveys let us look at a lot of different variables and collect quantitative values for them, and then we look at correlations. Qualitative designs, we use that to get a deeper insight into a phenomenon. We are looking at smaller samples, and we are looking at interpretation. So correlations, we are using that for reliability and validity. Qualitative research, we need to establish inter-rater reliability, and we do that by establishing a coding manual where two different people looking at the same data set will come up to the same conclusion 80% of the time. That's really what inter-rater reliability is. For qualitative studies, we are focusing on the interpretation of words or observations that we look at. Mixed methods designs are both qualitative and quantitative. We are getting evidence from both types, and we're looking at triangulation. We want to see again, we still have to establish inter-rater reliability, and also now we're looking at internal consistency reliability for any survey measures that we might be taking. So mixed methods is more work, but what's nice with mixed methods is you have quite high internal validity and external validity. You're not doing manipulation, but because you're getting many different types of data points, that increases the integrity of your study. Qualitative designs, remember, it's much harder to establish validity with that because of the nature of the study that you're doing. Observational designs, you can have naturalistic, you can have systematic observations and recordings. Remember, for observational designs, you are, again, establishing inter-rater reliability. You need to make sure that at least, two people looking at the same observations come up to the same conclusions 80% of the time. There is a quantitative component to observational studies if you're doing systematic observations. And the last type of non-experimental research would be change over time. This involves other designs as well. So these longitudinal, cross-sectional, and mixed methods involves change, right? We're looking at developmental change, but the way you'd establish that is going to be through surveys or interviews or mixed methods or observations. So keep in mind that if you say you want to do a longitudinal study, you also have to share what are you going to do in those studies. When you keep bringing these people back, what are you doing with them? Are you taking surveys? Are you taking physiological measures? Are you interviewing them? So all of these different types of research are folded into developmental studies as well. Any questions about these different non-experimental research designs? And stop the recording.